one thing I heard you talk about at the very start of this conversation was artificial sweeteners, specifically.
Ooh, yeah, let's do that.
Specifically in things like Diet Coke. I've wondered for a while whether Diet Coke is healthy or not.
Okay.
And there's a lot of, people talking about this at the moment. So what's your answer to that?
Okay. This is going to be the most commented thing about in this entire interview, I'm sure.
Oh, gosh.
Okay. So first off, let's just talk about weight loss and fat loss. Okay. And leave out the other stuff. If you look at the epidemiology and the cohort studies, you tend to see that people who consume more artificial sweeteners or diet soda are heavier in body weight. And so some people have said these things cause weight gain. But the problem with that is, again, lifestyle behaviors. And so one of the things they've shown is that people who consume more artificial sweeteners actually tended to be more overweight to start with, obese to start with. They didn't cause them to become that way. They're consuming more of them because they're trying to get to a less obese state, right? So there's a correlation there. But if we look at the randomized control trials, right, where they say, hey, you guys drink soda, regular soda, you guys drink diet soda. There was actually one that just got published, a very, very, really rigorously controlled 1-year study. Way more weight loss in the diet soda group. And I'm thinking of another randomized control trial. I think it was 6 months where they saw like 6 kilograms of weight loss just from switching people from regular soda to diet soda. Or it might not have been soda specifically. They call them sugar sweetened beverages versus, non-nutritive sweetened beverages. So when you replace for soda, it seems to be very effective, all things being equal. And people will say, well, it activates the sweetness in the brain and you get hungrier from it. Well, if that's the case, then these studies would suggest that artificial sweeteners are actually the best fat burners known to man, because if people are eating more and still losing 6 kilograms, that's amazing. They're not fat burners. They're replacing that sweet taste. And then people will say, well, it's not better than water. Water, people should just drink water. Shoot the alligator closest to the boat, right? Like, okay, hey, if you can drink water and just drink water, cool, do that, right? But if somebody can lose, and I have people all the time when I do a post about this, somebody say, I lost 30, 40, 50 pounds. All I did was stop drinking regular soda and drink diet soda. Literally the only change they made in their life. Now, when they compare it versus water, they either see the same results or the diet soda group gets a little bit better results. And yeah, now, it's not because of any kind of fat burning effect. What is likely is when somebody switches from regular sugar sweetened beverage to water, they may try to fill that gap of that sweet taste somewhere else. Whereas if they're just consuming the artificially sweetened or non-nutritive sweetened beverage, we can't say artificial because stevia is actually, natural, so to say. So they call it non-nutritive sweeteners. But if they're consuming the non-nutritive sweeteners, they're filling that gap.
Compensation again.
Compensating, right. So now, again, there's nothing magic about them. People are just eating less, right? And if you can do that with water, you don't have to consume diet soda. I would say drink water. But if you're somebody where, man, you really have a hard time quitting regular soda, heck yeah, drinking diet soda is a lot better. And then people will go, well, what about insulin? They raise insulin. That is actually one of the biggest myths out there. There are multiple, not just studies, but now I'm pretty sure there's a meta-analysis as well that shows that these artificial sweeteners do not raise insulin. There is one study, I'm thinking specifically about sucralose. There's one study, and everybody always hangs their hats on this, and I love to break it down, where sucralose did not increase insulin, but they did a sucralose group, a carbohydrate only group, and a carbohydrate plus sucralose group. And the results were the carbohydrate plus sucralose group secreted more insulin than the carbohydrate only group, even though they ate the same amount of carbs. And so people go, well, see, maybe it's not bad, but if you're, drinking it with carbohydrates, it's bad. And this is where reading the full text and really going deep on a study is very important. So the carbohydrate only group was sucrose, which is 50% glucose, 50% fructose. The carbohydrate plus sucralose group was maltodextrin. Maltodextrin, if you look at, are you familiar with glycemic index?
Loosely.
Yeah. So glycemic index basically looks at like, how quickly glucose appears in your system. And usually you can kind of correlate the insulin response to that. Maltodextrin has a significantly higher glycemic index and causes a greater insulin response than sucrose because it actually causes a greater insulin response than even glucose itself because it's kind of getting into the biochemistry, but because it's like this polymer, it is actually a little bit more rapidly digested and absorbed into the circulation. So it was actually an inappropriate control group to try to assess that. Because if you look at the difference in insulin response, it's about what you'd expect if you just look at maltodextrin versus sucrose. So based on the research, there's no evidence it affects glycemia or increases insulin. And in fact, in these studies where they, these randomized control trials where they look at, weight loss, you see improvements in insulin sensitivity, HbA1c, because people are losing weight, not because of anything magic with these sweeteners.
Is sugar addictive?
This one's going to get me in trouble too. I want to come back to the artificial sweeteners, but I'll answer that. Sugar by itself does not appear to be addictive. There are certain foods that appear to create what's called a food dependence. There's subtle differences between that and addiction. But I mean, kind of the anecdote is nobody's like just grabbing the bag of sucrose and just, eating that. And if you think about the foods that really are like very hard to stop eating, they're usually not just high in sugar. It's a combination of sugar, fat, salt, and texture. Okay. Texture matters as well, and mouthfeel. People will say, well, sugar's addictive. Look at cakes, cookies, ice cream. There's more calories from fat in those than there are sugar in a lot of cases. So couldn't you, by that logic, just argue that fat is also addictive? So sugar, straight sugar, doesn't appear to be addictive per se. Now, it's not very satiating, right? And it's utterly devoid of any other kind of nutrient. So I'm not saying it's a good idea to eat a lot of sugar, but it doesn't appear to have addictive qualities in isolation. But there are certain foods, cakes, cookies, these sorts of foods, hyper palatable, very great mouthfeel, potato chips, French fries. These sorts of foods may have like semi-addictive type properties, okay, but just sugar itself doesn't appear to. And there's a study that kind of backs that up. Basically, I think the title was like no evidence for sugar addiction in humans.
So people will say, well, when I eat that piece of chocolate or that, sugary thing, I end up just eating more and more and more and more and more and more. And then the next day I feel like I need sugar more. And I've got my own sort of anecdotal experience of, I almost call it like a sugar cycle, where there might be a week, once every 4 months or 6 months where I have some sugar and then the next day I want more sugar and then the next day I want more sugar and then the next day. And then when I break that sugar cycle, and if I don't eat sugar for like 5 days, it feels like the craving's gone away. Mm-hmm. You must hear that from people.
Yeah, I mean,
like right now I have no urge to have sugar for some reason.
Yeah. It's so hard to disentangle that from just psychology in general, right? And just like, that could be a self-fulfilling thing where it's like, people have been told sugar is addictive or they've heard sugar is addictive. And so they eat some and they feel that mood. I guess, but also like, again, the chocolate, usually also high in fat, right? Like the mouth feels really good. So I'm not saying like that stuff is easy to overeat on and people can have a hard time stopping, but it doesn't appear that sugar like independently is addictive, but it can be part of foods that may have addictive like properties.
Artificial sweeteners, you said you wanted to close off there.
Yeah. So now let's talk. So we very clearly, the research studies show the ones that are controlled well, it does help with weight loss in a lot of these studies. What about cancer, heart disease, and the gut microbiome? Because that's a lot of the questions that are out there. So with cancer, a lot of people think, oh, there's so many studies showing it causes cancer. Well, first of all, again, we're talking about epidemiology. We're talking about cohort studies. So there's a lot of confounding variables. But actually, so we were talking about consensus earlier. It's kind of I'm on their scientific advisory board, and it's like PubMed plus Chat GPT. So you can ask it a question and it will immediately like crawl all the research literature and give you a consensus of what the research says, right? And so I did this, and you can synthesize it too, where it'll show you what percentage of studies say yes, no, and then possibly, right? So I think I put in, do artificial sweeteners cause cancer? Do you know 80% of the studies say no? But you don't hear about those. And why is that? Because it's much more newsworthy to put out negative news. Because if you hear a study, this thing doesn't cause cancer, ho-hum, right? But what gets shared a lot? Oh man, Aunt Deborah, she drinks Diet Coke. Deb, have you seen this? You know, it's much more shareable. So that negative news tends to get published more, right? And if you look at the human studies, some of the more well-done ones, like I'm thinking of the Nutrisanti cohort out of France, the conclusion was, oh, it increased the risk of cancer. And I looked into it. I think it was aspartame specifically. If something's carcinogenic, typically what we see is a dose response, right? So if you smoke more, you have a higher risk of lung cancer. Did you know that so they compared like no or like low amount of aspartame users to like low moderate and then high moderate? I want to say it was 3 different groups. So I could be butchering this a little bit, but think low, medium, high, right? The medium group had a higher risk of cancer. The high group didn't. It actually, like, not compared to the low group, it was not statistically different, but it dropped from the moderate group. So to me, and again, we're talking about an odds ratio of like 1.15, meaning a 15% relative risk increase. Let me put that in perspective. 15% sounds scary when it comes to cancer, but relative risk means if your absolute risk of developing cancer in, say, the next 10 years is 10%, a relative risk increase of 15% says it goes up to 11.5.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean it goes from 10 to 25, right? So it's important to understand the difference. But again, if it's really carcinogenic, we should expect to see kind of a dose response, right? We don't see that. So to me, that's, especially with all the studies that don't find an association, that's more likely to be some kind of data artifact with, who knows, confounding variables, healthy user bias, what have you.
What about the gut then?
So now there are studies showing that some sweeteners do change the gut microflora, the composition of it. Sucralose appears to, aspartame, not so much. I think saccharin also showed a change to the gut microbiome. Now, here's what's interesting. It's hard to know if that is a good, bad, or neutral change in terms of overall health, because I was looking through one of the studies on sucralose, and they were talking about a couple of species or genuses of bacteria that increased. And one of them that increased was actually associated with people who are leaner, have less obesity, and better insulin sensitivity. And also a species that produce more butyrate. And butyrate actually is associated with a whole host. This is a short-chain fatty acid produced by the gut microbiome. Butyrate's associated with a whole host of positive health benefits. So I will say it's worth monitoring because some of these do appear to change the breakdown of the gut microbiota. But there's probably, you could argue just as much that there's a positive effect as you could a negative effect. So what I'll say is, again, if we look back at shoot the alligator closest to the boat, and there are no solutions, only trade-offs. If somebody switches to diet soda, even if it's not the very best thing they could do, maybe water's the very best thing they could do. But if they lose 20 pounds and their HbA1c drops and their insulin sensitivity gets better and their metabolic health gets better, it's probably a worthwhile trade-off.